Hey there, Quillers. Jake Lloyd here, producer of Don't Quill the Messenger and co-founder of Dragon Wagon Radio. I just wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about my debut feature film, Pinch. Pinch is the story of two strangers brought together by the chance to own a rare and valuable sports collectible. But to do so, they're tasked with stepping out of their comfort zones and onto a baseball field. It is a story about marriage, family, how we define success, and how sometimes it's hard to look beyond our own insecurities. I made Pinch with no budget, no crew, just a ton of heart, and I am thrilled to share it with you. It's available for rent or purchase digitally on Prime Video. Visit pinchmovie.com and follow @pinchmovie on Instagram for more info on this charming little movie that means the world to me. Thank you so much for listening to Dragon Wagon Radio. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Cue the music. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Steven Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. We're so glad that you could join us for this next episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. We're so thrilled that you choose to bring us with you wherever you are, whether it's in your car, in your shower, on your morning jog, or just a quiet time alone in a room because you really want to absorb the wonderful and exciting things that we have to say here on the program. But thank you for choosing us as one of your podcast streaming options. And today's episode, we want to talk to Dorothea Dickerman. She started asking questions about whether Will of Stratford had really written the Shakespeare canon by the time she was age 10. Following a bachelor's degree summa cum laude, wow, from Amherst College in English and Political Science, and then a JD, that's Juris Doctorate for those of you who don't understand JD terms, University of Chicago Law School, and a 34-year career structuring billions of dollars of deals as a commercial real estate partner in a 1,000-lawyer-member international law firm. Wow, that's a lot of lawyers. I wonder what Shakespeare would have thought about that. She retired from law to research and write. She's currently writing a historical novel on the life of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, to answer the question. Dorothea believes that like good lawyers, good novelists and playwrights make site visits in person, and she's joining us today to talk about her first of several Bard-targeted trips, say that 5 times fast, made with her lawyer husband, Rich Becker. And this one that they just recently took was to the north of Italy. And like any two lawyers, of course, Dorothea and Rich disagree on all kinds of things. But one particular key point is, was William Shakespeare a pen name? And if so, for whom? And Dorothea recently gave a presentation to the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. on this topic. It was a very interesting and fun presentation about her travels with her husband, Rich, and whether or not she was able to convince him of the argument. Like two lawyers. Can you imagine two lawyers traveling Italy together, arguing over Shakespeare? How much fun is that? Dorothea, tell us all about it.
It was a lot of fun. It really, as you know, lawyers love to argue, and being married for decades, there are things you resolve and things you don't. And Rich and I could not, did not, he would not, let's put it that way, understand that it was impossible for Will of Stratford to have written the Shakespeare canon. So Rich is a very, very smart guy. He's got a BA from Princeton in history, magna cum laude. He went to Harvard Law School. He practiced corporate mergers and acquisitions. He taught as an adjunct law professor at George Mason, and he's currently in a master's program in history at the University of Edinburgh. So about him, I say, he is not a flat earther.
When you two start some sort of discussion or argument or disagreement, does lightning like shoot out of the building? That's a lot of brain power the two of you have. My word.
Yeah,
I feel humbled by the magnitude of the intelligence going on in that. Talk about a power couple. Wow.
Well, Rich has always said that we couldn't be married to anybody else because one of us would certainly roll right over the other person. And Rich's perspective on this was a history perspective. Mine, of course, began as a literary perspective, but his was it would have come out by now if the facts were not that Will of Stratford wrote the canon just like it says in the plays. And Rich's background was that he'd read 3 of the plays in high school, which was some time ago. And that was kind of the last point at which he had investigated the canon. And yet, I think, like many people, he was firmly entrenched in the attitude that that's what he had been taught. And of course, we all tend to cling to what we've been taught unless you ask questions, because things don't make sense to you. So I had argued fact with him. I had given him examples of other writers from the Elizabethan period, which was most of them, using pseudonyms or using their initials, or indeed the vast quantity of work that is anonymous. And it really turns out that most people wrote anonymously. I explained to him that nobles couldn't write sonnets or poems without being seen as frivolous. They couldn't write plays without being seen as undignified unless those plays were performed at court. I explained to him that there were 20 questions that we have that have come through various writers about who is this author before Oxford died in 1604, and another 10 more before Will of Stratford died in 1616. And then you have 100 years where nobody really talks about the Shakespeare plays. You have 20 years where the theaters are closed by the Puritans, and then everything adds up to 100 years of silence until someone decides to write the national biography of all great Englishmen and sends an investigator out to Stratford, who comes back with scraps about Will of Stratford. That goes into a biography, and that biography sits untouched, unedited for another 100 years until people start to have recollections of 200 years ago that add to this wonderful mystery of the genius that is Will
Do you
of
remember
Stratford.
that time? Hey, do you remember that time 200 years ago when we
Exactly.
were illegally hunting deer in a nobleman's lands and we got in trouble for it?
Yeah, exactly. So I explained all of this to Rich, and he became more and more entrenched in his position, and I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. So what do you do as a lawyer? And we're both transactional lawyers. We're not litigators, right? So we persuade through a variety of means. So I sat down and I finally said, okay, just tell me why you don't really believe it. And his answer surprised me and caused me to think about how to persuade other people, including lawyers, in different ways. He said, I understand the playwright's reputation, but frankly, the canon doesn't interest me, except for the history plays. And that for me was a light bulb, because I realized.
So why take him to Italy then and not take him through England and do like the historical trip?
Because one of the facts that is undisputed about Will of Stratford, even by Stratfordians, is that Will never left England. There are 13 plays that are set in Italy, and some people claim that there are 15 plays set in Italy. And I said to him, let's take a trip to Italy and let's go see these places. Let's look at the plays and let's try to suss it out. There's a wonderful book out there for any quillers who are not experienced in the issue of the authorship issue. I have to say that one of the landslide books is Richard Rowe's A Shakespeare Guide to Italy. It is a wonderful doorway to walk through. Just as you're entertaining these ideas in your mind, you may not totally believe the story, but seeing it in place, seeing where the plays were set, I'm a real estate lawyer, commercial real estate lawyer. So setting.
You're looking at it from the perspective of, oh, there's that palace. I wonder what that's worth
exactly,
today.
exactly.
Oh, and there's that location. Oh, that must be worth a lot of money.
No, what we do is we set up little sim worlds, right? We need to understand how physical locations work. We need to understand how people walk through space. And in doing research for this novel, I really wanted to visit almost every place that Oxford had been, because I don't take other people's words for things. I'm a lawyer, right? And I have to see for myself. So I thought, this will be fun. Rich loves Italy. It's got great food. It's got beautiful climate. So I set up an itinerary based on just the portion of Oxford's trip between Milan and Venice. And I took row, and I took the plays, and I did a boatload of research before I went. One of the things that I have done in the last 3 years is learned Italian, and that enables me to read in Italian, which is enormously helpful in researching this. And off we went. And that's how we started out in Milan, although I don't think that Oxford actually entered the city ever. But we were following his trail through, and my purpose was if I could show Rich how the plays actually reflect the land, the topography, the monuments that we could still find, he might become convinced that someone who never left England could not have known those details.
So how many cities did you go through, and how long were you there?
We had been to Italy many times, so this was, it's not our first trip, and we'd been to these cities before, but not with this type of focus. So we started in Milan, but I don't think Oxford started in Milan. And then we proceeded east. We went to Milan, we went to Verona, we went to Mantua, we went to Freetown, Verona, Sabagnetta, Padua, and ultimately Venice.
Mm-hmm. And so along the way, about how much time did you spend in each of those cities?
We were gone for 23 days. So Venice and Milan had the largest chunk of that time. I don't think we were anywhere less than 3 days. And we spent more time in some places than we had planned. Mantua, for example, really its claim to fame is in the canon is very small, which is that Romeo is banished to Mantua, and there's a scene where he buys the poison from the apothecary and then returns secretly to Verona. But I was very convinced that Oxford had spent a chunk of time in Mantua with the Gonzaga family. So we spent more time in Mantua than we had originally planned, because there was a lot left of Renaissance Mantua.
So, and while you're in each of these cities, are you like searching? Are you doing research? Are you like going to libraries? Are you going to historical sites? Are you trying to find evidence of Oxford? Or are you just trying to experience the locations the way he would have, to see how they may have informed the writings?
All of the above, I would say. You've actually brilliantly hit on everything. I find the concept of time travel to be intoxicating, and to walk through a place and try to locate what remains of a Renaissance city. I mean, the reason that we go to these cities, all of us go as tourists, right? We don't want to see modern Milan. We want to see old Milan. We don't want to see the most modern apartment buildings in Verona. We want to walk the quaint streets, right? But this goes a layer below.
I always
that.
want to touch things. My wife will laugh at me. We took a trip 2 years ago to Cancun, and we went down to Chichen Itza. And, we got to the site, which is, of course, now very, very touristy, as most historical sites have become. But, I wanted to go and touch the stones and put my hands on the rocks. And she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm feeling the history of this." She said, "You're so weird." Yeah, but I have this tactile need. Part of it's that I'm Italian and we're very tactile people. But I have a tactile need to touch the history, to touch the building, to touch the object, which is really maddening when I go to a museum and I want to pick up artifacts or things. And, there's guards standing there going, don't touch anything. But yeah, I have a very tactile need. So I get it. I get like wanting to walk the cobblestones, as it were, and kind of put yourself in the shoes of the historical character or the people of the time.
Yeah, so we started in Milan. We started in Milan because Malpensa has direct flights from Washington to Milan, right? You're there. And Milan, the old city, is, I would say it's an awkwardly eight-sided figure, which still exists today. And the Sforza Palace, the Sforzas were the princes of Milan. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you note in the Italian plays is that we always talk about princes and dukes. And the reason for that is Italy was a peninsula called Italy in Oxford's lifetime, but it was not a country. It was this assemblage of fiefdoms held by warring dukes and princes who finally got it together with some treaties in about 1569 that divided it up. But Milan was controlled by Spain. So not exactly a warm, fuzzy place for an Englishman who's a Protestant to land. But Milan has gates, and you can still see some of them. It was also at the time, as all of northern Italy was, connected by canals. And this is something that I think a lot of modern people have a hard time understanding.
Oh, absolutely. And when I talk about, one of the things I love to talk about is Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Ah, yes, that is the play.
That is such a key play to understanding how whoever wrote that play had to have been standing right there and had to have used those canals for transportation in order to know how they worked and the intricate network of them and how they were and how they're no longer there now. And so to go there and to try to find some of them, now some of them, if you read Rowe's book, obviously you have, but for our listeners, if you read Rowe's book, he went and he tried to find some of them and he did locate some of them. And some of them are just now, drainage ditches that once were these wide canals that would usually by either ox or donkey or sometimes horse would pull barges along the canal. And that was the form of transportation. And it was so much better than riding a bumpy road in a carriage.
And so much safer. Banditos.
From guess what? From bandits. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
What happens in Two Gentlemen of Verona? Oh yeah, bandits.
So Milan actually had two concentric circles of canal around it and huge canals that connected Milan as a port to other cities and other rivers and ultimately to the sea. So I wanted to see these canals. And one of the things we went to Milan to do was to actually see the canals. And Via Gioia Martesana runs straight north out of the city, which was a huge canal in Oxford's time. It is now a street, a very wide street with cars on it. But if you pursue it out just a little way, maybe 3/4 of a mile, you come to a place where the canal still exists, where banks on the canal still exist. You can sail on it today. You can bike along its banks. And what you see is this giant canal going through a grate and dropping down hundreds of feet. Because of course, the water doesn't go away. You can't stop it where you have a flood, right? So they put the water in conduits and sent it under the city. It comes out the other side. The Pavese Canal still exists today. And the Sforza Palace, which of course was the palace of the Dukes of Milan. If you think about Tempest before Tempest begins, the backstory of Tempest is that Prospero and his tiny daughter, Miranda, are taken by his brother and dumped into a small bark at night, robbed of his dukedom, and sent away down these canals to the Tyrrhenian Sea, where they are swept by the waves down the coast of Italy to an island in the south, which is another trip. But also, as you say, the two gentlemen from Verona sailed the Martesana Canal into Milan in 1533, which is the year Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Shakespeare calls him an emperor, is in Milan for 5 days with his court, because you want to be presented to the court as a young man of a noble family in Verona. And of course, it does match Oxford's trip as he is returning to England from Italy to go by that north side. And the other thing that I wanted to see that was there was the Lazaretto, which was the city built just outside the walls on the north, where plague victims were sent in 1575 and 76, when there was a horrible plague in Milan, which is another reason I think Oxford never entered the city. It's because not only was it Spanish and hostile, it's not where you wanted to go. And of course, today with COVID, we can understand that a lot better than we used to. So Rich and I...
he didn't just put on his mask and
not really.
Go right in? He was a nobleman. He could have walked in and said, okay, everybody, 6 feet. Everyone stay 6 feet away from me. I'm a nobleman.
With those big beaky masks, right? Which keep everybody at a distance. That's why the beak is there.
Right. You can't rub noses with those things on.
Yeah, you don't want to touch anyone's face. So Rich and I did exactly what you're talking about, Stephen, exactly what you want to do, which is I located the Lazaretto, or what was the Lazaretto, because of course it was bulldozed under in 1880, and found the little church at the center, which had been a little open-sided chapel. There are 16,000 people suffering with the plague in Milan in that Lazaretto. It's huge. It's 5 blocks by 5 blocks by 5 blocks by 5 blocks. It's an entire city. And now it's this beautiful neighborhood, absolutely stunningly beautiful neighborhood in Milan, built right over this plague-infested area. And that's one example of how history lives under your feet, just like the canals live under your feet. You don't see it, but,
I wonder if the people who live in that neighborhood have any ghost stories to tell. It's kind of creepy, don't you think? Like, oh yeah, we're gonna move into. We've made it. We're moving on up to the east side of Milan. Oh yeah, and P.S. this beautiful suburban neighborhood was built on top of a bunch of dead plague victims. Congratulations!
Yes,
enjoy your beautiful house with your wonderfully manicured lawn and your gorgeous trees, and don't mind a few ghosts from the medieval period. It's okay.
Well, anyway, Rich was impressed with my research because it was sort of the beginning of walking around that Lazaretto and seeing the Milanese Canal. He was beginning to understand, I guess, that I'd done a good job, and that, this was not a completely crazy thing to be doing. So Milan served that purpose very nicely for us. It kind of, tuned his ear in a little bit. And from there, we went and spent time in Mantua.
Now, here's a question I have for you. So you did, you take Richard Rowe's book, Shakespeare's Guide to Italy, and then you pair that with your own research, and then obviously, travel guides or travel sites, and you're doing the whole Expedia.com thing or whatever to get things organized for where you're going to rent a car or where you're going to take public transportation and what cities you're going to stay in and what hotels or Airbnbs or whatever it all becomes, right? So all that takes a ton of time, doesn't it? To plan a trip like that?
Yeah, it takes months to plan a trip. I mean, to be honest with you, because I read all the plays. And I read all the plays in my copy of the first folio,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite a heavy tome, but it is actually a facsimile.
Do you have the Norton? I have the Norton facsimile.
Yeah, I do. And it weighs a ton, but
Yes, it does.
and you have to get used to the F's and the S's and
Yes.
being able to distinguish them. But what you find when you do that, of course, is that words have been changed. I use the Riverside Shakespeare as my go-to text for, ordinary reading of the plays. But even in the Riverside, there are words that have been changed, and those come to be, particularly symbolic, because they tend to erase clues of Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, that otherwise appear. And when you read from the first folio facsimile itself, wouldn't it be fun to own a first folio? Of course it would. Everybody's dream.
My facsimile copy cost me $125. I was
going to say it was not a cheap book.
No.
But certainly cheap by comparison. So, what's so interesting about Mantua is Guglielmo Gonzaga, who was a good friend of the King of France, Henri III. Oxford's first stop was in Paris. He was sent there to represent his queen at the wedding and coronation of Henri III. Henri was the third of four sons of Catherine de' Medici and Henry II of France. Unfortunately, his older brothers died. That made him king, and he travels in 1574 from Poland, where he was king. He makes this grand tour of Europe, sweeping up through Italy on his triumphant arrival to Paris. This is, of course, the year before Oxford goes to his coronation. And on the way, he is entertained at some of the places that show up in the plays, very particularly in the plays. And so what is so intriguing to me is, since they show up in the plays, since Henri was there, and Oxford obviously spends 6 weeks in Henri's company, as well as his younger brother, the Duc d'Alençon, his sister, Marguerite de Valois, so many of these characters that are represented elsewhere in the canon. Does it not make sense that there were introductions made for Oxford on his travels? And
so
so
wait a minute. So what you're telling me is that Henri III, and I want to get too deep in the historical weeds.
No, we don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole.
But I love this narrative here, because I haven't heard anyone mention this before, and I'm sure somebody must have fallen on this and maybe has done some research on this. But it sounds like what you're saying to me is Henri III became Oxford's Richard Roe. In that
maybe,
he said to Oxford, while Oxford's hanging out in Paris with him for 6 weeks, he says, "Oh, you're going into Italy? Well, here, you need to go here, and you need to visit there, and you need to see this guy, and I'll write you a letter so that you can meet with this guy, and you want to stay with this family. Oh, they make great pasta, and you want to go over here where the wine is awesome." Like, it sounds like he was Oxford's travel agent. When we make a trip today and we're sitting around with our friends and we hear that our friends are going to the place that we visited, don't we say exactly that? Absolutely we do. And so that makes perfect sense. And I don't know why anyone hasn't touched on that before, or why I haven't heard of anyone touching on that before. But man, that's a great path to follow to further prove that Oxford is the writer. And
it gets really interesting in Venice, and it gets really interesting in Mantua. And here's why. The Duke in Mantua is a fellow named Guglielmo Gonzaga. He is extremely musical. He also accompanied, guess who, Henri III on his trip. So as Henri's coming back, he's traveling with Guglielmo. Guglielmo is Henri's pal. I don't know. I haven't been able to discover if Guglielmo was in Paris for the wedding. It would surprise me if he was not, but perhaps he couldn't make it for some reason. It was February, who knows if he could cross the Alps. That might have been an impediment. But if you take a look at any text of Merchant of Venice, and you are looking at the scene where Nerissa, who is the maid, and Portia are talking about the various suitors who have come to Portia's door in Belmont. Nerissa says, "Don't you remember that young man that came in the company last year of the Duke of Montferrat?" Well, for me, when I read something in the text of the canon that is unusual, it's like a little blip. It's like, who is the Marquis of Montferrat? So I put it down, I go do some research, and I find that the Marquis of Montferrat was, guess who? Guglielmo Gonzaga. And when did his title change to Duke? His title changed to Duke in 1574. So that starts to put pieces together in my head of Guglielmo and Henri III traveling to Villa Foscari, which Rowe claims, and I think he's probably right, is Belmont. The reason is it is exactly 5 miles from Il Mole, which is the landing in Venice. And we hear in Merchant of Venice that Portia needs to travel 10 miles to Venice and back. So 5 times 2 is 10. Villa Foscari was owned by the Foscari family. And on Henri's trip, Villa Foscari was where they had a beautiful, beautiful car in Venice, but they chose to entertain him in their country house on a canal, which is east of Padua and west of Venice, for several days. And there are drawings and announcements and books written about it in Italian, which you can read, talking about this visit that Henri made when he was entertained by the Foscaris. So connecting the dots, it again seems logical to me that is an introduction that was specific to Oxford, because he was in Rheims, not in Paris, but in Rheims for the coronation and the wedding of Henri, whose good friend is Guglielmo. And that is why I said I think Oxford spent his first stop in Italy as he came over the Brenner Pass was to go to Mantua. And the reason for that is because I think he got the introduction to Guglielmo from Henri.
Henri has this friend Gonzaga, not unlike Gonzalo.
That's a good one, Stephen.
Of the canon as well, right? And so here's what I wanted to know. So, excuse me. So you plan this whole trip, you plan this whole itinerary because you know what you're looking for and you know what you want to go prove to yourself in some ways, right? Or to see because Rowe has said, "Oh, I believe this is what was meant here in this part of the canon," and you want to go either confirm or perhaps debunk what Rowe's thesis is. But at the same time, you have this underlying motive to this trip, which is that you're bringing this skeptic along with you who you happen to have been married to for decades, and you're trying to demonstrate evidence to this other legal mind that who understands his mind more than you because of the length of your marriage and because you're both lawyers and all that goes with that. So you have this jury that you're bringing along with you that you're trying to present evidence to for an outcome at the end. Were you planning as well along the way, like points of evidence? Were you preparing your arguments, your opening statements and your evidentiary delivery and then your closing statements while you were planning the trip? Or did that sort of organically form through the trip?
I think that you can do all sorts of planning, but you can never control somebody else's mind. And interestingly, the difference in Rich really started to click right after my, what shall I say, the nadir of my experience. Rowe had gone out on a limb claiming that Sapignetta, which is this lovely little medieval town was actually the setting for Midsummer Night's Dream. And the reason he said that was the case is that Sabagnata is known as Little Athens. So I had done a ton of research on this fact. And one of the things that I felt very strongly about is you have a lot of Greek references. You also have a huge number of Roman references in that play. And then you have references to things like nuns and cloisters and chivalry and knights and a Bergamask, which is a dance from Bergamo.
Right.
Again, that is a huge clue to me. Wait, Bergamo's in Italy. This is supposed to be in Greece. And the playwright keeps talking about Athenians and Athens, and sometimes gratuitously in the same line, he keeps mentioning it. So one is suspicious, but this is a pretty crazy idea, right? That this play is actually set in Italy. So we went to Sabagnata, which
well,
is
of course,
wonderful.
the orthodoxy would say that that's proof that it was William of Stratford because he didn't really know Italy and he didn't really know Greece, and he combines these references together out of his ignorance. He's a genius. He's a genius who sparked up out of the ground with the touch of Zeus, but he's ignorant in these facts, and it shows in these Italian plays.
That is certainly an argument. And Rowe worked very hard trying to locate things in Sabagnata. One thing he didn't talk about is, today you can find the words Little Athens on the soccer team logo for Sabagnata. But there is a huge statue of Athena that sits on a pedestal in the middle of a large piazza in Sabagnata. Turns out that statue was brought there in 1527 from the sack of Rome by Rodomonte Colonna, who was the duke before Oxford's time. And she has been there, lording it over her little Athens for centuries, certainly before Oxford arrived. I think that Sabagnata was the hardest part of the argument to make. It's when we got to Verona that things really got interesting. I think many people know that Juliet's house is not really the Capulet house. It's kind of a Disney World, or perhaps one might say a Stratford-upon-Avon.
I was going to go there, but you beat me to the punch.
Yeah. we kind of know that. We kind of know it, but it's fun to go, right? You're going to go because, you're going to go, right?
It's not really Juliet's balcony. It's a balcony that kind of looks like Juliet's balcony. This isn't really Shakespeare's house. This is a house that might have been Shakespeare's house.
Right, exactly. So the Montague house has a tiny little plaque on it. I mean, it's not open. You can't go in. But the thing that got Rich was the graveyard, outside graveyard, these beautiful tombs of the Scaglieri family. Because the Scaligeri were the princes or the dukes of Verona, and Rich happened to know a lot about them. So he started lecturing me. He started telling me history while we were standing outside these tombs. And all of a sudden, it was like we were working together. And once that happens, nothing stands in our way. It's a matter of pulling him over. And I said, well, the prince is called Escalus in the play. And he goes, really? And I go, yeah. Do you hear it? It's Gli Scaligeri in Italian. Escalus in the play. So working together, all of a sudden, I think he felt, maybe there is something to this idea that you wouldn't have known it. And that, by the time we made our way to Venice, had really bloomed into his being as interested in chasing down the clues as I was.
So suddenly your Professor Moriarty became your Dr. Watson. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
That's exactly right. I mean, I don't know that I would have known to go to the Arsenale in Venice, except for Rich wanted to see it. And the Arsenale becomes enormously important. And what it was at the time, sort of the largest industrial complex in the world. It was where Venetians made their ships, and they made them from prefabricated parts. So they could assemble a warship in a single day. And Arsenale has 2 miles of these really high ramparts. I mean, it's pretty clear. It's, I'm from Washington, D.C., and there are areas in Washington, D.C. around in the countryside that are really fortified. Like, it's CIA, you don't want to go there. And that's the way the Arsenale was. Well, if you're England and you are considering that Spain may be attacking you, making warships quickly could be something of interest. And so I began to read Othello in a very different way, because Rich took me to the east of Venice, where this enormous area had been, remnants of which you can still see today. You can still see the gate and the walls, and it's not as big as it was because they filled a lot of it in, but certainly you get a sense for it. And the thing about Othello that's so exciting for me is that the Battle of Cyprus, which, by the way, the Venetians lost, Shakespeare takes it and turns it into the Armada battle. And one of the things that causes England to win is this terrible storm that batters the Spanish Armada. Well, in Othello, one of the things that incorrectly causes the Venetians to win the battle for Cyprus is a terrible storm that so batters the Turks, which is what they call the Ottoman Empire, that their fleet is lost. And then there's this wonderful line where the third gentleman says, a ship is here put in, a Veer or Ver Nessa, and it is spelled Verenessa. The ship has seen grievous wrack and sufferance on most part of their fleet. So this ship, called a Verenessa, is portrayed by this playwright as being a very effective ship in Othello's command against the Turks, which is really the Elizabethan fight against the Spanish Armada. And when you look at the Riverside Shakespeare or newer versions, you see that the word has been corrupted from Verenessa to Veronsa. A Veronese ship from Venice has seen great wrack and sufferance upon most part of their fleet. And you might ask, what ship from Verona of Venice would that be? And that is a corruption or change in the text by somebody who decided to change a word from the folio.
Right.
Because he or she, probably he, thought it made more sense.
Well, and you'll remember that I gave a presentation on this topic, not specifically throughout history, the changing of words, but on the topic of the newest fashion of changing words in Shakespeare and trying to make them more palatable to a modern audience. And my argument against it, of course, was that not only was it a corruption of the text, but it was also risking further eliminating the clues to the authorship. And you just pointed out a perfect example of that, where the author put a clue in about his identity, but because it made no sense to an editor, they changed the word. But you're talking about a guy who plays with words, whose neologism is, astounding, and a lot of that is because he's putting in these clues, these references to people, including himself. And when a modern editor goes through and goes, oh, there's no such thing as a Veronesa ship, he must have meant Veronesa.
One from Verona.
Yeah, right. And so it gets changed and wipes the author away from the page even further.
That's exactly right. I mean, and that is also another reason for visiting these locations in person, because people make assumptions all the time. I mean, not only can you say, they do things differently in the past. Don't make assumptions about history based on what you know today, because it's a foreign country. They did things differently there. But another example of this comes from The Taming of the Shrew, set in Padua, which is one of the cities that we visited. And there is a immediate predecessor to the taming of the shrew called the Taming of a Shrew. And both plays, very, very, very similar. The first, The Taming of a Shrew, being anonymous. The second, The Taming of the Shrew, being by William Shakespeare. The Taming of the Shrew does not open in Padua. It actually opens in England. And I know, Stephen, that you have directed this play, and I know how very, very difficult it is to have to make choices about what to cut. But I want you to do me a favor sometime.
You want me to produce the play and keep the sly scenes in?
Would you
Oh,
please?
Dorothea, it's so hard to do it that way.
I know it is. I know it is, but it's really important, and you know why. For those who don't recall this, maybe you've never seen the play produced this way, but if you read the play, even the one in the first folio, you see this drunk tinker, whose name is Christopher Sly, who's kind of sloshing around and not paying his bar bills, and a lord with his hunting dogs and his horses, who kind of resembles Oxford because he's got a troupe of actors, decides it would be a hysterical joke to take this drunk tinker, put him in a beautiful bed, put him in clean clothes, have servants, the Lord's servants, serve him, and have one of the young actors dress up as the Lord's wife and convince him he has always been a lord. And one of the things they use to convince him is he sits on the stage, eating his food, kind of out of it, right? Drinking his wine, making passes at this young lad playing his wife who's pushing him off. It's very funny. And the play on the stage that entertains him is, of course, A Taming of a Shrew, which is all about illusions and, things having double meanings. And
a lot of characters pretending to be people they are not.
That is exactly
in disguise.
right. And so
there's a lot of disguises going on in Taming of the Shrew.
There is. And that last speech that everyone has so much trouble with, where Katerina says, women be subservient to your husbands, of course, done very tongue-in-cheek, and you and I have discussed this. And as a matter of fact, I think it's one of the first discussions we ever had together, because we both think she's playing for the money.
Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind. She is not, and she's absolutely not saying be subservient to your husband. She's saying, if your husband asks you to do something, he has a plan and it's for the well-being of both of you. Go along with the plan and then ask questions later. Why did you make me do that? Oh, because we just made 100 crowns. Oh, great. I'm so glad I did that and didn't question you in front of everybody. Yeah, exactly.
And it's a lesson about spouses working together. But the end of The Taming of a Shrew has a part that The Taming of the Shrew has lost, which is the closing scene with Christopher Sly, the drunk tinker. And he has this wonderful line where I imagine him just kind of putting his hands on his cheeks as all of these fineries are melting away, and he's being tossed back out in the cold as who he was, which was a tinker who had too much to drink in the local pub. And he goes, Am I not Don Cristo Veri? I mean, he says Vere's name. And that piece is another major clue that the play, why would the playwright pick Edward de Vere's ship to highlight in Othello? Why would the playwright choose Edward de Vere's name that this drunk tinker thinks he must have been in that this is who he was? It all points again to this author.
Well, it also points to the idea of the author identity being disguised. And
exactly.
It even further would corroborate those who believe that the man from Stratford was a front that was selected on purpose at the time. And now there's a lot of argument about that. There's a lot of argument about, well, when and why did Will Shakespeare suddenly get credit for all of this? And, some people believe that it was by design at the time, and some people believe that it was mere coincidence when it occurred, or that Johnson and the composers of the first folio needed a scapegoat, so to speak, and selected this guy. So there's, that's an entire conversation all in itself as to how Stratford became the guy and when was that decided and by whom. But this point that you're making definitely argues in favor of there being some sort of phony or commoner who was getting credit or being convinced that he was of noble status and capable of this type of work.
That's right, and that's why I do say at some point, just do it.
Well, I
Stephen, you're so talented. I've got to give you some real reach for it challenges.
I probably will be producing and directing that show in the next 2 years. It's on my list and slated for proposal for a couple of venues that I work with. And so it's quite possible. And now I'm like, damn you, Dorothea.
I know. Curse me later. Or curse me now on the air. I don't care.
It's a very difficult. The play itself, without those scenes, without the bookends, I call it, the play is the perfect length, for one thing, without having to cut anything. And it's much more digestible for an audience that isn't as familiar with the canon as, say, you or I or others who are, great lovers of the canon. When you put those scenes in, it creates this tremendous potential for extreme confusion by an audience who doesn't understand what's going on. And you don't know, one thing you certainly know is the subtext that we're talking about here is not going to play. And so, yes, my Oxfordian heart says, keep this in because it demonstrates further the Oxfordian cause. But my practical producer director hat says you could lose your audience before you even start the real story. And so I'll struggle with that. I'll tell you now.
All right. Well, the question, that I think has remained unanswered is where did Rich end up after all this?
Well,
right?
That's one of the reasons why I asked you about, did you have a plan in mind? Did you have you had a travel itinerary? Did you have a case itinerary?
I did, and I'll tell you why. I think that for many people, as they are exposed to the idea that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. By the way, Voltaire did not write Voltaire, and Molière did not write Molière. Those were also pen names. But once you're sort of trying to get your mind around how this could be a pen name, you need to first accept the fact that there is one, maybe two reasons why it could be Willis Stratford. One, he's got the name, and two, he seems to have been an actor in London. Other than that, there really is nothing that ties him there. However, as you start to look at De Vere, and one of the reasons I'm doing this novel is because I think for people to take the time to learn about De Vere's life, they see 3 or 4 connections to the plays. Then they see 10, then they see 20, then they see 200, then they see 2,000, then they see 100,000. Reasons why what we call as lawyers circumstantial evidence. That is not direct evidence. You're never going, Rich wanted the plays in Oxford's hand.
Don't we all?
Looking for the plays in Will of Stratford's hand, right, for 400 years, assuming Rich could write. His father, his mother, his wife, and all of his adult children were illiterate. But the, Stratfordians assume that, Will could write. Even if we assume Will could write, which doesn't seem likely from the evidence, there are no letters, there are no poems, there's no bill of sale, there is no drafts, there is nothing.
We don't even have proof.
And
some people who say, well, we have proof he could write. We have signatures. Well, yes, and those signatures prove he couldn't spell. So
well, there are 6 of them that have not yet been proven to fraud. There are lots and lots and lots of Shakespeare signature frauds that have gone down the tubes, but only 2 of those 6 signatures match. So either we have 2 original signatures and the other 4 are phonies. We have 1 original signature and 5 are phonies, or we have none.
Exactly. And of course, many of those signatures are spelled differently. And I know
They
that
are.
I know people who can't spell and who aren't really proficient at spelling, but I'll tell you the one thing they never do is misspell their own name.
Well, also, as small children, what is the first thing we are taught to do when we are learning to write? We are taught to write
Absolutely.
our names. And my name is long, Dorothea. It's a lot of letters. It's 8 letters. But it's the first thing we learn. And so even people who can write their names are not necessarily capable of writing or reading anything else.
Exactly.
So anyway.
So you finished the trip in Venice, right?
I ended this thing with all of this circumstantial evidence. I thought if I could just pile the circumstantial evidence on by experience, Rich would finally agree. So we are in Venice. We've had a fantastic time. We've seen lots of other stuff and lots of other evidence of Oxford that, I'm happy to talk about. But the most important moment, we're on this beautiful balcony of the Danieli Hotel, sipping Bellinis, which were, the drink of the summer in Italy. Bellinis were created at the Danieli Hotel. And we're looking at the glorious Venice stretched out below us with, a late afternoon or early evening sun going down. And I'd kept my mouth shut, Stephen. I had really, really decided not to ask the question before the last day. And I turned to him and I go, so, did I convince you that Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, wrote the Shakespeare canon? And my husband looks at me and he says, I don't know. I don't have enough information. And I'm staring at him with my mouth open because I'm like, what else can I do? And then he gives me this sly smile and he kind of looks out across the water at San Maria Salute and the boats glittering. And then he looks back at me and he goes, but I will tell you something. There is no way that Willis Stratford wrote that canon. Nobody could have known that many details about that many places here in Italy unless he had been here himself. Definitive statement. And I was like, okay, I got half the battle.
Yes, and that's interesting because John Shahan from the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, who has been a guest on this program in the past, he is one who has always strongly argued that is the first step in the battle, that you have to begin by pointing out how it could not have been the Stratford man. And once people are convinced that it was not the Stratford man, once they can let go of that mythology that has been so ingrained in them, then they can open up their minds to the question of, well, if it wasn't him, who was it? And so that's been a philosophy of John's for a very long time, and also many other members of this group that
Jim Warren's working on a book on that, which I think will turn out to be very interesting. But for me, it was really important to have this very important person, the most important person in my life, come to terms with believing me.
Now, is he going to go sign the petition of reasonable doubt?
I could go push him on that, but it took decades, and I think the point is that I had to find the right way of introducing the material to him. And for people who are oh yeah, there's Shakespeare, and maybe I go to a Shakespeare play once a year or something, and what does it all mean? Now where Rich is, and he realizes it's not the guy from Stratford, and it took a couple more trips for me to really move him to the De Vere side of the equation. It did not happen all at once. But he's now realizing that the history plays are not only about history to Oxford, what history was to Oxford, Henry IV, Henry V, Richard II. Those are history plays to Oxford because they happened before his time. But they have characters and issues that were live political issues in the Elizabethan court. And so do the comedies, which he was less interested in, and the tragedies. Those are also ways of time traveling, eyewitness history lessons, written for you by somebody who was in the court watching it happen, and the characters on the stage, big chunks of them, or even small chunks of them, are portraits of live Elizabethans that he was either mocking or honoring, or himself. He appears as himself, of course, in pieces of him in every single
That's an
play.
argument
He's
that I
telling
make
you.
all the time. And when I am directing the plays and I have a group of actors, I very seldom will bring up the Oxfordian position directly. Oftentimes, I'm very Socratic about that when I'm dealing with actors, because I need them invested in the story we're telling, not the story of the authorship question. But inevitably they cross, because I point out, as I'm directing and as we're doing our scansion together, I will point out some of those references. I will point out some of those things that have been inserted, because it's helpful for the actor to understand mainly what they're saying and why. And one of the things that I point out quite often, not only to actors while directing, but then later in later conversations, is the number one audience of these plays most of the time was the Queen herself. And there are a lot of moments in every play that are directed specifically to her.
Audience of one is the way I
Absolutely
put it.
right. And there are, moments where he is trying to convince her on policy. He is trying to convince her on PR. There are so many. He's trying to convince her on how she should feel about other people in the court. She is the number one audience member for him when he's writing anything at first. And then the rest become the rest of the audience, the other members of court, the other noblemen who he knows are going to see the play. And then, of course, the public comes last. And, we hear all the time about how he wrote to two audiences. And I think that's so narrow-minded. No, he wrote to 4 or 5 different audiences with every play. But she was the primary audience in every case, I believe.
Yeah, I think that is completely correct. And almost every play is based on his trying to warn her or caution her about something that's happening in the Tudor court.
Absolutely.
Someone she could become, someone she might have been. And sometimes he's just trying to make her feel better about who she's been. For example, Midsummer Night's Dream. It was all a dream,
right?
Your Majesty. You didn't really stroke the ears of that ridiculous Duc d'Alençon.
Exactly right.
Did you?
Well, and I always argue that it represents Oberon, and he is saying to her, "I'm your true love."
Yes. And that little boy, but that's another tale.
Whole nother tale. Well, I think it's an incredible story, and unfortunately, not all of us have the opportunity to plan a Richard Rowe guided tour of Italy in order to convince our spouse or loved ones or someone in our lives who we want to share the Shakespeare authorship question with and the Oxfordian position. But what an interesting way that you went about. And I know that this is one of several trips that you have taken, some to Italy under this same premise, yes, and some to other places.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, I would assume.
Yes.
Have you done the Oxford trip to France? Have you?
That was to have been done this year. Unfortunately, shall we just say circumstances so far have prevented that.
What about the Oxford tour of England, and Castle Hedingham and all of that?
The Oxford tour of England, yeah, we've done that twice. Because there was so much, you couldn't really cover it in 2 weeks or so. So the second part of that trip we did in January of this year, and then, as I said, we were planning the part through France for this summer, but obviously we're not.
Well, I know you're
working
on a biographical novel of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. But I'm wondering if you, and you know, this always happens with each of our programs as we come upon some idea where I'm the idea guy who always says to the guest, you know what you should do, and then I walk away. So
Yeah.
in this case for you is, you know, what would be a great idea is, and I know I would buy them immediately and then start making my plans. But why not be the travel agent to all of us Oxfordians and all of us who are interested in this question and all the fellow Quillers who are listening to this program right now, and publish a guide on how to plan a trip like this and key places to visit and potential places to stay that are in close proximity to some of the things that you need to see and the amount of time that you recommend that you spend in each city in order to get to these places. Like, I would love to have something like that. You've done all the work. Why not put it all down on paper for the rest of us so that we get to cheat and just follow your guide and do it?
Stephen, you know what? I gave you a task, and you've given me one, and I think it's excellent. Certainly doing one in London is really illuminating, not just because of Oxford, but you realize how small a city the city of London actually was. And even Westminster, outside the walls of London, not a very big place. And you understand how quickly you can walk from location to location. Not only for a novelist, you know, who sees how people move in space and how they know each other and how they bump into each other. But I think that's, and how, you know, like how far out were the curtain and the theater? Where exactly is Hackney? Where did Oxford live in Hackney? All of that, yes, we've done all of that. And it really helps. And I think it's a great idea to write about.
It'd be great, cool little travel guides. And, you know, only you will know how long they need to be and in what format they would best be published. But I guarantee you that there are people who would just snatch those up and use them as a template for their future travels. I know I am definitely one of those people. You know, as many of our listeners know, because I've mentioned it before in previous episodes, you know, Annie and I have twice planned our Oxford tour of Italy and twice had to postpone that trip due to the arrival of our children. And so, you know, in fact, we have friends who joke and say, don't plan any more trips to Italy unless you plan on having more children. Because it seems like that's the magic key for us is we plan the trip and then bang, here comes a baby. So, which of course we're absolutely not sad about at all. And Italy's going nowhere. It will be there for us. But having someone like yourself who has done all of that work and with this in mind, I think for sure that would be something people would love to get their hands on. And, you know, a series, you could do the Northern Italy, you can do just Venice, you could do, as you said, just London, you could do the England tour, once you do the France tour, maybe even do that trip over the Alps.
That's planned as well.
So
I had to figure out which pass it was, and that took a bunch of research, but it's the lower one where the Venetian trade routes went. I've become convinced of that.
Can you also do the boat trip back from the continent to England and the abduction by Dutch pirates? Because that would be a really good one.
You know, Stephen, I'm going to depend on you to do the pirate part. But if you do the pirate part, I'll get out there and have me as or maybe we'll have Rich be Oxford with all the goods, you know, getting snatched by the pirates in the channel.
Awesome. You know, several years back when I had my Shakespeare Festival in Southern California, we would do concept style productions. And one of the concepts we did, one of the more talented directors that I've had the pleasure to work with and who I contracted to produce a production for the festival. His name is Michael Eastman, and he we were in our planning meetings, and I said, I want to do Two Gentlemen of Verona, and I want to do it with a pirate theme. And he took that and he ran with it, and it became a magnificent production. And of course, it worked extremely well because of all of the talk about ships and sailing and the port of Milan and the bandits, which of course pirates, bandits are pretty synonymous, and it became a fantastic play. It also was a wonderful way to address the very uncomfortable moments of the scenes where you have this, almost rape occurring on the stage in a comedy. Ha ha, rape is funny. Thank you for that one, Shakespeare, because that's a tough one to get around. But, what do pirates do? They rape, pillage, and plunder. And so it helped to keep that moment more lighthearted and less dramatic and more in the flavor of a comedic play because of that pirate element that we put on it. And of course, it did open the door for me to always point out what I always love to point out, which is P.S. Pirates. That's always my go-to. Well, what makes you so convinced that this, that, and the other thing? P.S. Pirates. Hamlet, pirates, done. Yeah.
Pirates.
Well, Dorothea, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I would be lying if I didn't sit here and say that I have been envious the entire time listening to you and listening to the places that you've gone and the things that you've seen, and the great opportunity that you've had to share that with your spouse as well. And I'm sure that a lot of our listeners who have people in their lives who look at them askance when they approach the Shakespeare authorship question, or find us to be weird Shakespeare nerds, or believe that we're flat earthers, or whatever they want to call us, to try to diminish the facts and the truth that we've come upon. I certainly envy you, and I can't wait to do my own trip. And maybe I'll have to wait now until you publish a guide for me to follow.
Oh, maybe I'll just, write it up and send it to you.
Well, then I'll publish it and take 10% off the top. I don't know. Actually, I do not want to tangle horns with a real estate lawyer who has been doing billions of dollars a deal throughout her life. Yeah, I'm afraid I'll lose that battle.
I'll tell you, it's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you as always. And, everybody finds their own path. Obviously, my husband represents somebody who's extremely well educated and very, very smart, but who had his own reasons for being attached to something that he had learned early on. I spent decades trying to convince him, but it was this concept of how much of a pile of circumstantial evidence does it take before a person, and it's different for everybody, says, okay, I get it, it's impossible. And these trips are a pleasure. They are certainly a ton of work. The hours I pour into them are truly untold. I'm often reading, not just English, Italian sources, French sources. Fortunately, my high school French holds up well enough for that. My high school Latin is not holding up, but maybe at some point I'll go back and refresh that with some classes. But it's fascinating work, and I have to say I hope that everyone who's listening to this will take some time to read and learn some more about the Earl of Oxford and file it away and pull it out next time you are sitting in a theater or watching it on your screen from home and say, doesn't this look like something that happened to him?
Well, thank you so much for sharing and for taking the time to be with us today on this episode. We do want to remind all of our listeners that Don't Quill the Messenger is brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. And if you haven't taken some time to explore ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, You definitely need to do that. Spend a little time, peruse the pages. You'll find so much information there, and it is definitely a wealth of resources for you in your own exploration of this topic and in your personal journey. As Dorothea mentioned, we all have ours, and hopefully you will continue on yours. So please visit the website and bounce around some pages and take a look at some things that you'll find there, and it will lead you on your path to discovering truth for you about the Shakespeare authorship question. We also want to remind you to please give us a rate and a review from wherever you're streaming the program. If you're streaming from a source that allows you to give us 5 stars, we'd love to have them. If you're streaming from a source that allows you to write a few notes of comment, please do that as well. And don't forget, you can reach out to us as well. And if you go to dragonwagonradio.com, dragonwagonradio.com. We're a proud member of dragonwagonradio.com programming, and there are a lot of other podcasts available there that you may enjoy as well. So check that out, and you can also reach out to us through that site and give us your comments, give us your suggestions. We even get hate mail, and actually we kind of like it. So go ahead and send us your hate mail if you'd like to, because we'll be doing a future episode. We'll be talking about some of the comments that we receive. We've done a couple of episodes in the past on that, and it's been a lot of fun. You can also pick up your Dragon Wagon swag. That's where you'll find Don't Quill the Messenger products and merchandise. Everything you purchase goes to support the show, and we appreciate that support. So if you'd like to get a coffee mug or a t-shirt or some of the other wonderful items that are available there, please do. I'm drinking coffee right now, this moment, out of my Don't Quill the Messenger coffee mug. It is a tremendous high-quality coffee mug with great print. It has held up very well over the last 2 years that we've been doing this program, and it has withstood several thousand dishwasher runs. So please pick up some swag and support the program. We want to thank our guest, Dorothea Dickerman, for joining us for today's episode. And we want to thank you, fellow Quillers, for being loyal listeners. And we want to always remind you, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.